record on KCR 2221-1623, State of Idaho versus Chad Guy Daybell. We took the lunch recess. We're back on the record with additional testimony. Dr. Hampikian is on the stand. I'll remind the witness you're still under oath for your testimony. And Mr. Pryor, you may continue with your direct if you wish.
And we're back.
You may.
Welcome back with Dr. Hampikian.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hampikian.
Good afternoon.
Hampikian.
I think where we left off, is I was going to start talking up the testing procedures that were conducted in this particular group of evidence that you were provided.
Hopefully we'll find out where Pryor's going with this.
Before we do that, can you then identify, if to the best of your recollection, what evidence you looked at and what did it encompass?
I was supplied with a number of documents and electronic files. The things that are most important to me are the electronic files with the DNA data.
Our friends are
because we
coming
have
back.
our own software that we can review that through and do probabilities and interpretations from. But I also receive things like, CVs and laboratory records that we review, and then a list of evidence, a lot of which wasn't tested. So I have, there are dozens of items on these lists of evidence. And what's most important is the things that were tested. And so for those, I have reports from 3 laboratories, Bodie Laboratories, Estrella, and the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab. And along with those, we have electronic records that allow us to reanalyze if we need to, if there's any problems. And I can't remember what other documents. There's a large packet of things that come through, but really it's the biological evidence that I pay most attention to.
And in regard to the state lab, you read a report which described a number of hairs on a piece of adhesive. Do you recall that tape?
Yeah, there were a lot, more than a dozen hairs, as I recall, but a lot of hairs.
And do you recall the different colors of those hairs on that adhesive?
Brown. There was very short, dark hair, a blonde hair. Those are the ones I remember. And obviously there were a number of the dark hairs, and I think several of blonde hairs.
And at some point, as a result of on that tape and those hairs, and you said over a dozen hairs on that tape?
I don't know if they were all from that tape, but there are a bunch of hairs listed and only a few went on to testing. So
okay, and when you talk about that, the state lab is not the agency that's going to test that. Is that correct?
the state lab tests hairs generally when there's a root on them, but some of these other tests where there's no root, it's just the hair shaft. There's labs like Bodie and Estrella, both of the other 2 labs, that will process those and get really good results from hairs without roots.
And is it possible to obtain DNA from hairs without roots?
Yeah, just about, just a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, they started advertising this at some of the private labs that police agencies use, like Bodie. And then Estrella is one of the newer companies that specializes in, particularly in hairs that don't have roots.
Things progress quickly.
As far as Estrella is concerned, the only thing that you have in terms of Estrella is that of the brown hairs, the blonde hairs, and the short hair, the brown hairs were sent over for testing to Estrella. Is that what you recall?
Not all of them, but for some reason, certain ones were selected. Okay. And as I recall, 4 test hairs went to Estrella. Their first test is to do what's called a low depth sequencing. So they're basically just going to sequence parts of the 3 billion bases, not the whole thing. And that's because it's cheaper and it takes less computer time. And they can then tell you if the hairs are sufficient to go on further. So from that first shallow sequencing that they do, they get what they call a mitochondrial haplotype. They get some information about DNA we get from our mothers. And in that short sequencing, and the first thing they can do, they can tell if hairs are different from each other. And so they did that with the 4 hairs.
Did they compare those hairs on the ones that they sent to Astria against any, and I'm not sure what the proper term is, people or
References, perhaps?
references, I'm sorry, I struggled for the word.
So there are 3 references that were sent to Estrella: Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow, and JJ. And so those were the only 3 references that went through the type of testing that Estrella does. So this is a very particular type of testing, a sequence testing, different than what the state lab does currently. And so they could only compare it to those 3 samples, the 4 hairs that
Welcome
they
back,
have.
everybody.
They determined from the 4 hairs, that shallow sequencing, that 2 of the hairs came from possibly the same person. So they had 3 different people out of 4 hairs, and then they compared it to the 3 references they had, and all of the reference samples were excluded from each of those 4 hairs that represent 3 people. So neither Chad Daybell nor Lori Vallow nor JJ contributed those hairs. And then there's further analysis than they did, but that's the first main conclusion: is there's 3 different people who don't match the 3 reference samples, who left hairs that were sent to Estrella.
So at this point, what was basically sent to Estrella, the conclusion is that Chad Daybell was excluded as providing any of the hairs that were provided to Estrella as a positive. Would that be fair?
Yes.
Did you find any evidence of anything that you provided, that were provided to you through these DNA reports, indicating that Chad Daybell's DNA was present on anything?
No.
That's kind of weird considering it was
I
his
want to talk to
home.
you about conclusions and what type of conclusions someone in your field of DNA forensics can arrive at. And if you would talk a little bit about that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. In these common types of tests, there's basically 3 conclusions. I can say someone is excluded, and in other words, there's too many mismatches, and I can just say it's clearly not this reference sample that donated DNA to this evidence sample. So that's exclusion. And sometimes a statistic is provided, but it's not required. You can just say they're excluded and show the data. The other option that's informational is that they cannot be excluded. So that means they could have contributed that DNA on the evidence. And then we have to supply a statistic. Is it 1 out of 2 people would match it? What's the coincidental match? Is it 1 out of 100 trillion? And the third option is you can say it's inconclusive. So you can have exclusion, cannot be excluded with a statistic, inconclusive. When is it inconclusive? I drop a tube in lab. There's nothing in the tube. The test doesn't work. There's not, I doubt the results somehow. And that's an inconclusive. So those are the 3 options that we have.
Okay. And then when you get a conclusion that it's a negative result, what does that mean?
That's a really bad term because it means that what's negated is the hypothesis that was being tested. So, for example,
explain that to me when you say what's negated is the hypothesis being tested.
Let's say someone is accused of a crime, and I swab a handle of a knife, let's say. I have a reference sample from the accused. And really what
That
I'm
sounded
doing
very
is
akin to
hypothesizing that the
case.
reference sample matches the evidence sample. And I test that hypothesis, and a negative result means, in some ways, the way a lot of analysts use it, means that I've negated that hypothesis. It is not this person. It is an exclusion. So the unfortunate thing is negative result is used when we exclude someone, which is a perfectly valid result. And it's also used when it's inconclusive. Sometimes people say it was a negative result. You can think of it like a COVID test or a pregnancy test. You can be negative for the pregnancy or the disease, or the test could not work. And some people will sometimes refer to that as negative. There was no evidence. There's no test. But in the case of the labs, what they're really doing when they have a reference sample, as they had in this case, they had 3 reference samples, for example, at Estrella, they're testing the hypothesis.
Right, so what
Yeah.
hypothesis in this case are they testing?
Did Lori Vallow contribute the hair? Did Chad Daybell contribute the hair? Did JJ contribute the hair? So they tested 3 hypotheses, and in each case got a negative, a valid, very sensitive and correct answer that none of those people contributed those hairs. So that's how negative is used in that setting.
Is it used in other settings as well?
Yeah, and like I said, it's a tricky term the way people use it. So I sometimes there's a phrase in our field, if I can say it, it's that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So you can't prove you weren't somewhere just because they didn't find you there. That sounds like it's true. And I've heard experts like myself say it on the stand. And years ago, I was asked on the stand, isn't it true? The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And then I realized, no, it is the evidence of absence. Of course, it's the evidence. And I know that because in cases where we've done exonerations, there's evidence that other people did the crime. And to say that, just because there's no evidence from an innocent person that's meaningless. It is meaningful. Things are tested. You test a
Objection, narrative.
hypothesis. Yeah.
Sustained.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
So again, if I could ask a question,
Yeah.
the hypothesis you were talking about is in regards to the absence of evidence and how it relates to the testing procedures. Is that correct?
Sometimes negative results are referred to as the absence of evidence, and that's incorrect. These are well done, carefully done tests that negate a hypothesis. Did this person contribute? And that's important evidence.
Okay. So if I understand you correctly, it's not just showing that his DNA or her DNA is not on anything. It's the fact that the hypothesis suggesting that that person in some way contributed to whatever is being tested has been negated, and that the hypothesis that that person has been involved in that is negated as well.
Objection, argumentative.
Sustained.
Is the hypothesis that the person is present is negated by an absence of evidence?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
I would state it this way, that every piece of evidence can be weighed in terms of, does it favor one explanation or another? And so when we have a test where someone is excluded, that some people will refer to as negative, when we have a test where someone is excluded, it's up to the triers of fact to decide what hypotheses that favors. But it's evidence when someone is excluded, it's evidence when someone is included. The only thing that's not evidence is the inconclusive. Just forget about that one. But in this, positive and negative are important conclusions.
But would it be fair to say that in this particular case, there's an absence of Mr. Daybell's DNA on any of the items that you reviewed?
Yes, there's an absence of his evidence,
Okay.
of his sample, of his DNA.
And before we finish up, I would just like to touch on the fact that were the results that you reviewed in this case, were they valid?
Yeah, we check all their controls. And so they, anytime the lab's running a bunch of tests, they have some blank tubes with just the chemicals to make sure nobody's skin cells from the lab or the police got in there or whatever. And so the controls that we use in this case were standard controls at all 3 labs, and they all were okay. They were fine controls. So
They followed the
that's trustworthy.
They follow the proper testing procedures.
They follow the proper procedures, and they got good results with their controls.
They searched for the smallest or tiniest amount of DNA.
Very small amounts of DNA they searched.
Significantly small.
I mean, as small as they can go. So generally, we're looking at just a few cells now. So,
Okay.
20.
Is there any indication that anything went wrong with their testing procedures?
No.
And they had all the proper controls?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about with your familiarity with these testing labs. Do you have some sort of familiarity with Astrea?
Yes, yeah, I know, Dr. Ed Green, who's helped me on on a particular case. His technology, I believe, helped found that company. So I helped him with I gave him his first case, really.
You gave him his first case?
I believe it was, yeah.
Okay.
It's here in Idaho, too.
And you know Bode Laboratory?
I've been to Bodie many times or several times, and I was just on a panel or on a DNA panel with people from Bodie, so I know some of those folks who work there.
And the state police as well.
I know the state police folks pretty well. I see them at professional meetings. I visited the lab on occasion. Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, then you don't have any question about the procedures that they followed. Is that correct?
Not in this case, no.
What you question is maybe the range of what they decided to test.
I don't know who makes those decisions about what's being tested. I just know what ultimately gets tested. And in this case, 4 hairs were sent to Astrea. The very short, dark hair, it was called. And then the rest of them were brown hairs, 3 other brown hairs.
And then the hairs that weren't sent included blonde hairs.
That's correct.
Okay. Judge, I have nothing else. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right.
Johnny, he followed that up by contradicting himself and saying, but in the courtroom setting,
Mr. Wood, when
the
you're ready,
absence of DNA,
cross-examination.
the absence of evidence does mean the absence of proof, basically.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hampikian.
Good afternoon.
So he said that saying, and then he
So you testified, you do run a lab at VSU.
contradicted himself.
I do.
Is that an accredited forensic laboratory?
Not for the type of evidence the state police run, no.
Okay.
Mr. Wood, I apologize for the interruption. Could I have a quick sidebar with counsel, please?
So if I remember the saying correctly, it is, oh gosh, I wish I wrote it down at the time he said it. I don't know if it's the last witness or not, Crystal. But basically, I think what they're trying to say is that in the courtroom, you can't say that it can't be conclusive that the absence of evidence I think she was asking for last. But he's trying to say that in the courtroom setting, just because since you can't prove that the person was there, the absence of evidence you can't use that thing. So yes, we're definitely approaching the end of it. As I've been saying for the last few days, we should be done with the defense's case in chief by the end of this week. We should be. Yeah, I think he had a bad way of making his point too, because he contradicted himself, and he's very professorial. It's a very professorial way of speaking. We are very close. So what they're going to have to do is there's like,
The court wanted to clarify
One
the
or two more
matter, and I am
witnesses.
allowing a brief reopening of the direct in order to address that exhibit, and then we'll go back to cross. So, Mr. Pryor, you may approach.
okay.
Yes.
So there's one or two more
And
witnesses.
this relates to
in the
the
closing argument,
proposed exhibit 49A.
then the verdict.
And Judge, at this time, I'd move,
then
in my
death
understanding, is by stipulation to the admission of Exhibit 49A.
Okay, and that's the Astrea report. Does the state have any objection to the admission of exhibit 49A defense?
No objection.
Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Exhibit 49A is admitted. Thank you, Mr.
And
Pryor.
I'm done, Judge. Thank you.
So, and if there's a guilty verdict, then they would be on to the death penalty piece next week, unless
All right, and sorry on this exhibit again, do we have a separate
Yeah, no.
49 and 49A?
I believe there's a 49 and there's a 49A, Judge.
Okay, well, 49A is now admitted, which is paper copy of an Astria report. Thank you while we sort that out. Apologies for the interruption, Mr. Wood. You can commence and begin again or continue where you left off on your cross.
Thank you. Dr. Hampikian,
Yes.
hello again.
Hi.
So you testified you do run a lab,
Yes.
but for actual testing in a criminal case, you would send that off to someone else.
We do now. Yeah.
Was there a time when you tested it?
Yes, there was.
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you testified this lab you run that was not a forensically or an accredited forensic lab anymore, or it is not a.
We
forensic
never
accredited lab.
applied for the type of accreditation that Bodie and Estrella and the ISP lab have. We use the same procedure, same equipment, but we're an academic lab, and so we're not required to do that unless we wanted to take in, paid testing, which I don't want to do.
And you have a lot of students in your lab.
Yeah, I think 6 right now that are
Okay.
this summer.
hey, walk away, Renee. Good to see you. Yep.
Mr. Pryor spoke with you about the ISP testing.
Yes,
And did you review all of the lab reports for that testing?
I reviewed all I was given. I think I had all the reports. Yeah.
Did you review the test identifying the remains of Tylee Ryan?
Yes.
And you had no issues with that testing?
No.
Did you review the results of the test identifying JJ Vallow?
Yes.
And to be fair, it identified him to his biological father, Dennis Trahan, correct?
I believe, I can't remember, but it was a correct identification.
Okay.
Yeah.
And okay, so you didn't have any problem with that testing?
None at all. Mhm.
Did you review the testing of what appeared to be genetic material in the eye of a pickaxe?
Yes.
And did that testing, was it valid to you?
Yes.
On that same pickaxe, there was some testing done on what appeared to be a blood spot. Did you review that testing?
I believe they referred to it as the handle or
Yes.
yeah, the handle. Yep.
And that testing was fine with you?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And finally, there was some genetic material on the blade of a shovel. Did you review that testing?
Yes.
And that testing met criteria for you?
Yes.
And you're aware, you spoke about the Estrella lab testing. You were aware of the hair that got sent to Bodie Labs.
Yes.
And do you remember who that hair was tested against?
I don't know who it was tested against. I remember it matched Lori Vallow, as I recall.
Okay.
This is important cross because basically what
You wrote a
Rob
report
Wood
for
is
this case, correct?
validating is
I
that
wrote I wouldn't call it a report.
We
I
call
wrote
it a
what I was
summary.
going to testify to.
Okay.
he's not debunking what the state presented as DNA evidence. He's not debunking it. He's just
Your
testifying
Honor, if I may have one moment.
You may.
that he did not find Chad in any of the DNA evidence that was provided to him.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have no further questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wood.
Again, permission, Judge?
Yes, redirect, Mr. Pryor.
It took a long time to get through that, though.
And just very briefly, Dr. Hampinky, and in regards to the axe and the shovel,
Mhm.
Your testimony is that you acknowledge that there was valid samples on those for Tylee or for Tylee on those samples. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But isn't it true, Dr. Hampinkian? There is no accurate way to determine actually how those samples got on those tools, is there?
Not by anything that I can do with DNA.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Yep.
Judge, I have nothing else.
Okay. That will conclude the testimony of the witness then. Is he going to remain under subpoena by either the state or the defense, Mr. Pryor?
Judge, he's,
Yes,
me
Judge.
first. Judge, he's going to be excused.
We don't have him under subpoena.
Okay, that'll conclude your testimony. Thank you for appearing and testifying today. You can step down.
All right, who's our next witness?
And Judge, could we take a brief sidebar again? I apologize.
Yes.
Interesting. So I wonder if he's going to ask for a break or more time or a different witness, or maybe he's saying that was my last witness. I'm going to rest my case. I just wonder what, or it's evidentiary. Why is he asking for a sidebar? Separate topic. Another person has come forward on Diddy, you guys. Another woman dropped a lawsuit. I was just watching that before I went live. Oh, gosh. Why do they refer to her as Lori Vallow, not Daybell? You know, here, I'll tell you why I refer to her as Lori Vallow. I do it maliciously as a sign of disrespect to her. I do it literally maliciously as a sign of disrespect to that marriage. That's why I do it. I don't know why other people do it, but I have no disrespect for Lori, and I have no respect for that marriage. So that's why I do it. And if I'm wrong for that, you know, I'm okay. I'm okay with being wrong with that. I'm okay with being wrong about that. That's my way of throwing shade. That's very dark of me not to want to call her. And in all honesty, I feel bad calling her Lori Vallow because it's like, I feel like calling her Lori Devil or Lori. Yeah, I also agree. I was just about to say that, Christina. I was just about to say that. It dishonors Charles to call her Lori Vallow. She was Lori Vallow for a much longer time. Much, much longer time. I mean, they were married for like 13 years or something like that. So that's my reasoning. I'm not sure why in court. I'm not sure why. That bitch. Yeah. How about let's think of, maybe we should have a new naming contest for Lori. Like that bitch. Yeah. Monster. I know, we should call it Cora Whore. We should call her Cora Whore or Cora Lore. Because remember, that's what Melanie Gibb talked to her about on that recorded phone call. Lilith, yeah. Well, Melanie Gibb said that they were being Cora Whore, which is the devil, basically, like a villainous person in the Book of Mormon. Prison fabulous. Laura horror. I love that. Laura horror, prison fabulous. I've heard people call her Skittles because, when she first went to jail, when she would show up to court, you can't have makeup in prison. So in jail. So she used the Skittles trick to color her lips. The old Skittles trick. So some people were calling her Skittles. Truth Junkie. I remember prior stipulating he wanted Valo used in some hearing. Oh, interesting. I always thought it was in trying to distance Lori and Alex from Chad. But I also remember Lori stipulating she wants Daybell. And that is why I specifically said, oh, Lori, you want Daybell? Okay, I will now call you Valo. I mean, literally. I don't think there's been a case that I have followed in true crime in my time of very, very closely following and covering true crime where it was so clear who was guilty. It was so clear that these people were absolutely 1,000% guilty. I truly don't. I mean, so from the very beginning, this woman has been an object of my contempt, my absolute, utter disregard and contempt, such as it were. All right, what are we going to hear from the judge? What's next?
All right. At this time, after sidebar with counsel, we were talking about scheduling again.
Of course.
How we're going to proceed at this point is I am going to have the public excused from the courtroom.
Oh,
We are going to discuss some scheduling matters in the presence of the jury, but outside of the presence of the public.
oh,
And so
That's weird.
We'll take that up next. Ladies and gentlemen that are here from the public observing, thank you for complying with the courtroom conduct order today. I will note there won't be any additional testimony provided today. I am going to discuss the scheduling matter, though, with the jurors and counsel presence, with them
I
allowed to
know,
make
right?
comments as well.
Does that mean
So that will conclude the matter as it relates to the public proceedings in court today. The jury can remain seated. If we could have the courtroom cleared of the public, please. And case agent and the defense agent also are permitted to stay for these proceedings.
does that mean streaming stops, Judge? I think public means us too. I'm not. Yep, we be the public. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. All right. Well, I think you're right. I think that was the last witness. I'm pretty sure that tomorrow are going to be closing arguments. I'm pretty sure that was, yeah. I'm pretty sure what they want to do is give the jury a good idea of the scheduling from here, because also they have to tell the jury, the process. That if they decide, I did make my announcements. Do you want me to make them again, Crystal? You weren't here when I made them earlier. I will make them again, but let me, Johnny gets to go to bed on time. Yeah, so I think what they're going to have to do is give the jury an idea of what the process looks like from here. Lindsay came back today, so so hopefully she's doing fine. So your daughter called? Well, that's no excuse, Crystal. I thought you were stalking me. That's no excuse. I'm kidding. So I think what happens from here is they need to give a jury a sense for their schedule, right? They're very, very attentive to the juror's schedule, and I think that's fantastic. And Oh, is she really, Christina? Huh. I might have to be on the lookout for that. So they need to give the jury a sense for that. And what they need to do is once the verdict is read, then they're going to need to, so there's closing arguments, which will be tomorrow. The state and the defense, they probably both have a pretty good idea of how long their closing arguments will be. And then, and usually, closing arguments take something like an hour and a half each. So I would say closing arguments will take like at least half the day tomorrow. And then it'll go to the jury probably by the end of the day tomorrow or Friday morning. And then they'll probably take some time to deliberate. They'll probably take longer than the usual trial to deliberate because, of all the evidence and a lot of things to consider. They'll come back with the verdict. And so we'll probably have a verdict like, mid next week or something. And then they need to determine whether there's a death penalty. And before they can determine whether there's a death penalty, they need to hear testimony from victim impact, and then they need to hear mitigation testimony, on behalf of Chad. And that would be probably from his kids and other family members, that whoever's going to vouch for him. So that's what we can expect. So I see a live here that says lunch live with Dawson Murray, but there is no Dawson Murray on it. It just says lunch live with Dawson Murray, but there's no Dawson Murray on it, on Lauren's channel. So maybe she was just saying that she's going to be. So I don't think I'm going to wait for that to happen. I do think they'll deliberate for several days. I do. The guy representing himself is Jim Tellis, Stacy. That's Jim Tellis. And yeah, she said after court. I'll keep refreshing. But also, I would feel kind of bad restreaming that. That's her content. I might maybe I'll restream it tomorrow after she's gotten her views. It's her content. I feel kind of bad sniping people's content in real time. She was able to get that interview, and you know what I'm saying? So I don't think I'll restream it now. I think I'll wait maybe till tomorrow and show some of that tomorrow during breaks. So I am going, yeah, I'm pretty, Jim Tellis is the name, Stacy. So, all right, my announcements were, one is that the lovely Alex Erickson and Jen Liu, aka Bendy from the Ward Case Studies, are going to be joining me for the verdict. So whenever we find out that there's a verdict coming, they will join me on this channel and we will react together. So I'm excited about that. That's one thing. Yep, we all love them. They're awesome. And the other announcement is that I have received the trial transcripts from a hearing that took place on April 15th. And I will be going live soon to read them off. It was not a recorded trial. It was not a video trial. It was just transcribed. 16 pages of transcripts, and I'm going to read them off to you with some exhibits. So, and you can tell from this little screenshot here whose trial it was. From somebody who miraculously finally said the words guilty right out of her mouth. So that's the those were the announcements, Crystal. Thanks for asking. So anyway, I really appreciate you all being here. I love your funny comments. I love each and every one of you for being thanks, B Crumbs. Thanks each and every one of you for being here and being funny and kind and cool and smart and kind of crowdsourcing information for me sometimes when, you know, I can't find it or my hands are full or whatever. So I appreciate that. I will schedule a stream for tomorrow where I expect us to be hearing closing arguments unless, you know, Prior surprises us with another witness. Otherwise, yeah, that video on teachers, it's shocking, Stacy. In case you don't know, I have another channel called Checkmate Humanity. My most recent live stream was about female educators who seem to be getting caught every single day now sexually abusing children. And it's really, really concerning to me. So we talked about that. Anyway, thank you again. And I will definitely see you tomorrow. Bye. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.